And a warm welcome to our first speaker, providing and giving the Muslim perspective. Abbas Yunus is a researcher and analyst in contemporary religious affairs at the Taba Futures Initiative. So over to you, Abbas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Merciful and the Compassionate. Peace be upon you all, and thank you for inviting me to join you here today for this very important seminar. And I want to thank the Windsor and Maidenhead Community Forum for all the great work that they've been doing over the last 30 years and allowing me to contribute to it and participate in it. So, of course, it's impossible to answer the question of today's meeting in 10 minutes, and it would be somewhat pretentious of me to suggest otherwise. I can, however, offer some scattered thoughts and reflections on the question from an Islamic perspective, beginning with the fact that today is a poignant and somber milestone in our recent lives. A year since we entered a national lockdown is an apt moment for us to think about the meaning of hardship and suffering. As the pandemic swept through the population and continues to do so, its effects are felt far beyond those infected. It does not need me to state the hardships that almost all sections of our society have faced in the last year, but it does behoove us to think about the realizations that the pandemic has forced us to reckon with. If this year has shown anything, it's that the fate of any single one of us is inextricably linked to the fate of the rest of us. This echoes the parable of the ship drawn by the Prophet Muhammad, in which he provided an analogy of society as a ship with two decks. Each deck is occupied by a set of people. Those in the lower deck, who are perhaps the unluckier of the two, wish not to disturb the people above them when they need food and water. And so they talk among themselves and decide that they will make a hole just right here and access water for themselves directly. The Prophet stated that if the people of the upper deck allowed this to happen, then everyone in the ship would perish. But if the upper deck worked with the people in the lower deck and assisted them in attaining the food and water that they desired, then everyone would have benefit and ultimately life would have been preserved. So moments of hardship and suffering bring with them incredible challenges for our humanity, but they also carry in them the opportunity to bring us to intuitive realizations about togetherness. A community is like one body, said the Holy Prophet. If one part of it hurts, then the rest of it shall suffer too. Within our home lives, our neighborly lives, our local community lives, and our national lives, we have starkly recognized how the affliction of hardship to one member of society has a reciprocal effect on all the others, whether that's physically or mentally. So hardships and ordeals are recognized as inherent attributes of the world. They come as part of the furniture because one aspect of the world is that it's in Arabic, Dar al-Bala, the abode of tests, trials, and ordeals. So the passage of life dictates that we will inevitably be subject to this dimension of the world's nature. That said, the world is not only about trials and tribulations, and one's view of the world ought not to be solely occupied with this grim outlook, because ultimately the basis of life is that it's to be loved, cherished, and celebrated. Nor should hardship ought to be desired or celebrated in and of itself, sometimes as a form of privileging or proving one's own religious credentials, as if to say that persevering through hardship is a way of showing that one is religious or one has some type of religious superiority. The Prophet Muhammad advised his companions to always pray incessantly for well-being, and one of his oft-repeated prayers was, Lord, I seek your protection from blessings that diminish and a state of well-being that is reversed. So my words thus suggest that Islam raises the prospect of there being something in the endurance of hardship and suffering that can constitute and contribute to our humanity. To face hardships and ordeals, then, is not an experience in vain. Every experience of loss, suffering, and affliction may not be an experience that reflects the meaning of life nor its purpose, but it does serve to add something to our humanity that allows us to further realize the meaning of life. Such experiences teach us something about our humanity, and they offer us an opportunity to take stock and reset if needed. I don't think anyone would disagree that the last year, in view of all its difficulties, has also induced some important and necessary opportunities for us to value things that we had become complacent about, whether they relate to the personal, the inward, the social, or the communal. On this note, I'm reminded about a story about human traits involving one of the great comedic ancient figures of Islamic folklore, Mullah Nasruddin. One day, Nasruddin borrows a pot from his neighbor, and he returns it after a few days with a smaller pot inside. Upon seeing the two pots, the neighbor is confused because he only lent him one. So he asks Nasruddin about the smaller pot, to which Nasruddin says, "I have some wonderful news. During your pot stay at my house, it gave birth to this smaller pot." So the neighbor thought this was weird, but pleasingly accepted the extra pot nonetheless. A few weeks later, Nasruddin went to his neighbor again, and this time asked to borrow a larger pot in order to entertain a large number of guests. The neighbor happily lent him a large pot, but this time a few weeks had passed and Nasruddin had not come back to return the large pot. The neighbor went over and knocked the door, asking for his pot back. Nasruddin's eyes swelled up with tears and he uttered in a sad voice, "Your pot has died." The neighbor was infuriated and exclaimed, "You're crazy, man. Pots don't die." Nasruddin immediately replied to him, "Well, we have both accepted pots can give birth, so that means we must also accept that they can die." So when it was to the neighbor's benefit, he took the gift of the extra pot and disregarded the reason as to why. But when he experienced a loss in the form of his pot, the large pot, he became furious, even though the reason for his loss was essentially the same reason for gaining the earlier pot. The moral of this story is complemented by a Quranic insight, in which God describes a trait that people can sometimes exhibit. The Quran tells us, man exists in an impatient state. When misfortune befalls him, he is distressed. But when good fortune comes to him, he withholds. That is, when we experience hardships, we become anxious and worried, and this can sometimes lead us to count our blessings and perhaps become reflectful. But oftentimes when things are going good, we can become miserly with the good, and withhold it and not share it, and thus become somewhat forgetful about the more important things in life. In this regard, an ancient Islamic proverb states, "Familiarity is blessing's disease." In closing then, I'd like to say that the hardships and suffering that we experience come as part of the package of life. And from a Muslim perspective, they remind us that humanity can be fragile and susceptible, but also that in those moments of hardship, hope and trust ultimately rest with God and in God, and in that there is no surer affirmation of optimism for our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abbas. That was great. Thank you very much indeed. So, excellent. So, if anyone has a question, please, for Abbas or for any of the panelists, please do use the Q&A box below to ask the question. Thank you very much indeed. So I wonder, Anthony, I know you were going to go on after Sally. Would you like to go on now? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, if that's okay with Sally.
Is that all right, Sally? Yes, okay. Please give her a few minutes to get composed. So I'm now very pleased to welcome Dr. Anthony Lewis, who is the chair of the Windsor Humanists, and he's now going to give the humanist perspective to the same question. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everyone. Windsor Humanists are delighted and honoured to participate in this year's dialogues, especially in WAMCF's 40th year, to provide a humanist perspective on what is a very real issue for all of us: why do humans suffer? Humanists look to science, reason and evidence to understand the world and reality around us. A humanist view of suffering is formed by our common humanity, our evolved sense of empathy and our shared experience of life. And it's also informed by the huge advances in medicine and science achieved in the last 200 years, which have led to marked improvements in our physical, mental and social well-being. It's remarkable to consider that antibiotics, for example, have been around for less than 70 years, well within the lifetime of some WAMCF members. Put starkly, suffering is an unavoidable consequence of being alive and is an unfortunate experience we share with all living things. When we look at the natural world, we experience two conflicting sentiments. We wonder at the beauty of existence and the joys it can bring us. But in the wild, we also observe the brutal struggle to survive, to avoid being eaten as a daily focus for most creatures. The natural food chain from the lowliest viruses to the elephant consists of a vicious competition of who devours who. Based on archaeological evidence, we know the life of early humans in the Stone Age was brutal, as we lived short, impoverished lives with an average lifespan of just 35 years. Recent discoveries have revealed that nearly 50% of adult males in hunter-gatherer societies died at the hands of other men. As a species, Homo sapiens are uniquely violent to each other, adding further to our suffering. Cruelty and harm that is caused deliberately in this way by our fellow human beings somehow cuts us deeper and in more lasting ways. In contrast to these brutal origins, a child born today in the UK can now expect to live to 95, with a quality of life and health even billionaires could not enjoy in 1900. This miracle has been achieved through advances in agriculture, technology and cooperation. It is a story of human flourishing through our ingenuity that has helped mankind to transgress many areas of suffering, but where unfortunately we still have much to do. But as a humanist, I am optimistic for the future and our abilities to further reduce our suffering through continued scientific endeavour and social progress. However, despite these ongoing incredible advances, it's a sad truism that we will all suffer at some stages in our lives. Suffering is still the great unavoidable leveller. No matter who you are, how wealthy, high or low, or where you live, the brutal truth is that all of us as embodied living creatures will suffer to lesser and greater extents during our lives, in three main ways: through physical illness, through mental health issues, and through existential suffering when we experience death or loss, perhaps the hardest pain to bear. Clearly, these three kinds of suffering, the physical, the mental, and the existential, overlap and interact in ways far too complex to cover in just 10 minutes. But I'd like to cover one aspect of each briefly from a humanist perspective this evening. First, to physical suffering. I've already mentioned the impressive improvements in medicine that have transformed the health of most humans living today. Many diseases such as tuberculosis, smallpox have been vanquished or are now manageable, but there is still much suffering from poor pain control, cancers, multiple sclerosis, infectious diseases such as malaria, which still kill millions and cause enormous suffering in the world. There is still much to do. Genetic-based medicine promises further improvements over the next few decades. The rapid development of COVID vaccines in the last year is just the start of this coming revolution. However, modern medicine means that many of us are likely to face the awful decision of when to stop treatment or when to switch off the machines. The UK has one of the best palliative care sectors in the world with our hospice movement, but even so, our technology now allows us to prolong life indefinitely, which has the perverse effect of increasing suffering, especially at the end of life. This is why Windsor Humanists believe that all of us have a right to live, but we also have a right to a good death. And we actively support the campaign led by the wonderful charity Dignity in Dying to legalise assisted dying in the UK with appropriate safeguards. We believe that all of us have a right to decide for ourselves when the suffering we endure has become unbearable, especially when faced with a terminal illness. Moving on now to the second way of suffering, mental and emotional suffering. Modern medicine has also improved our understanding of the physical basis for many serious psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, psychosis, and other brain-based conditions, which can now be treated carefully with powerful drugs. Sufferers can now live near normal lives outside the mental institutions where we used to hide them away in days gone by. Thankfully, we are much more enlightened about mental health issues today. However, the persistent high rates of suicide, especially in teenage girls and young men, demonstrate that there remain real issues with respect to managing our mental health. Whatever life throws at us, all of us will have times in our life when we struggle to cope and feel we have nowhere to turn for help. Quite often, many of us do not want to burden our loved ones with our own distress during these difficult times. I volunteer as a Samaritan listener and have experienced firsthand how just listening to someone who's going through a difficult time without judgment and in complete confidence can really, really help them when they have no one else to turn to for whatever reason. Human kindness, altruism, and love is a special thing which sets us apart from other creatures. The power of authentic connection, love, and compassion from other human beings can be transformative for those coping with life's emergencies. The pandemic has very clearly demonstrated to all of us the power and importance of human connectedness. Nothing beats a good hug over a nice cup of tea or the relaxed banter between good friends over a pint of beer on a summer's afternoon. I yearn for the return of good long hugs with my friends. As a humanist, I really believe that the innate goodness in all of us will collectively far outweigh our darker instincts over the generations. Finally, I move on to the third form of suffering, perhaps the hardest of all three, existential suffering. Humans are probably the first creatures that have evolved both a direct awareness of our own mortality and have also developed the means through language to communicate with each other about the brute absurdity of our inevitable non-existence, a huge pivotal cognitive singularity in the evolution of life on Earth. This unique mortality salience about our own individual non-existence and those of our loved ones is a scary thing for all of us at a deep, personal, subjective, emotional level. The resultant existential terrors have driven our desires to explain our existence throughout the ages to assuage our fears. We all have to find our own path to make the most of our lives. Some of us seek solace in faith and religion, but as a humanist, I choose to focus on this one precious life that I experience directly and know about. I face squarely the mystery of existence and the suffering we will all experience from just being alive. I strive to live authentically and with good grace and humor. As a humanist, I believe in the unlimited power of human love, kindness, and compassion to carry us through times of distress. I believe our innate altruism and evolved sense of empathy will always endure over our more violent, primitive instincts. Otherwise, we would not have survived as a species to be here today. As all of us do, I have experienced physical, mental, and existential issues during my life. And what helped me most at those times was the love and kindness from others, sometimes from unexpected quarters. The power of human love and connectedness really is a special thing. Human contact and compassion heals and soothes us all of us in our times of need, whether the suffering is physical, mental, or existential, or even for some, all three. And for me, that is the thing that gets us all through times of distress, hardship, and suffering, whatever its nature. It is human contact. It is the power of human touch, of the loving hug, of the helping hand offered when you did not even know you needed it. So to end this brief exploration of human suffering, the humanist perspective on suffering is a simple message of hope and optimism. It's a belief and faith in our human capacity for love, which has the power to bring us together in common purpose so that all of us can be the best of who we are, to the benefit of ourselves and also to the benefit of others. I'd like to end with the humanist mantra for living a good life. It is very simple. We should all make the most of our lives for ourselves and others, and most importantly, be kind whilst we do it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Anthony. That's great. Thank you very much. So again, we have had a question in. If anyone has a question, please do put it right in below, just so we can ask our presenters the questions you might have. So finally, I'm very pleased to invite the Reverend Sally Lynch, who is the vicar of St. Luke's Church in Maidenhead, to provide a Christian perspective to the question. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Paul. 1,000 apologies. I must be the only vicar who's been ejected from a WAMCF meeting. But thank you very much to my colleague Phil, who is a good 2 meters away and wearing a face covering. The 25th anniversary of the Dunblane massacre, in which 16 primary school children and their teachers died at the hands of a suicidal gunman, reminded me of a conversation that I had not long afterwards with a class of 15-year-old pupils about the incident. I was writing a GCSE textbook at the time, and on a chapter on why do people suffer, I asked them their thoughts. They came up with some typical responses and focused on why God let it happen. So one conversation went like this. Child 1, no one has the right to pick and choose who should live and who shouldn't. Child 2, except God. Child 3, it wasn't God that made that decision, but the man with the gun. He had evil in him. Another 2 children. One said, God gave people a choice between good and bad so that they can do what they want to, free will. The other said, but others suffer if we all do what we want to. And another child said, everything happens for a reason. I don't know whether it's God or us that makes things happen, but this sounds awful. Dunblane might be a learning experience for us. We must learn something from it. Well, I could digress and ask if we have learnt from that atrocity. But those 15-year-olds offered some wisdom on the subject of suffering. I think rather more than the dean of the cathedral, who allegedly on the radio the next morning offered the pious assertion, God has a special place for little children. That conversation came out of a textbook, and it would be very easy to give standard Christian textbook answer to the question, why humans suffer. Christians have a wide variety of views. Traditional textbook responses might be, firstly, suffering is a test. We read the book of Job in the Old Testament part of our Bibles, where Satan tests Job to see how strong his faith is. Others might say that suffering is a punishment for sin. Job's friends tell him he's done wrong. And that's a view still held by many Christians. We suffer because we are sinful human beings, and so we are punished. The book of Job goes on to reject that idea. Finally, some would say suffering is part of God's plan, which is way beyond our understanding. The final chapters of that book of Job come closer to that. God speaks there for the first time and reminds Job that he is God and beyond understanding, to which Job replies, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. So that's a variety of textbook answers to suggest one possibly controversial reason why people suffer. Quite simply, because God loves us. Now, let me be very clear that I don't for one moment believe that God inflicts suffering on any single person. I'm quite sure that God weeps at times and wrings her hands when he sees what's going on in the world. But God doesn't inflict suffering as a punishment for doing wrong, or sin, as people might put it. I believe that God loves every single person, every being. The Bible tells us that God is love, so God cannot cause suffering. But nor can God permanently take it away in this world, because that would take away the free will that God longs for us to have. C.S. Lewis, the author, wrote when his wife was dying, try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature, as the existence of free will involve, and you'll find that you have excluded life itself. Human beings have free will as to live as they choose, and that freedom of choice leads to greed, selfishness, violence, and so on. And that causes other humans to suffer. We suffer because we are fallen human beings, frail human beings. We suffer because we are mortal. Christians believe that our souls will live forever, but our bodies are finite, and like tents, they wear out, they're damaged. Perhaps these days we think that we're inviolable, but we're not. And no one has ever promised that life would be easy. Christians believe that Jesus was God on earth, incarnate on this earth, showing people the best possible way how to live together, trying to avoid causing suffering to each other. Some people listened and acted. Others chose not to. Jesus was God in human form, Christians believe, yet still God. And that means that God knows just what it's like to suffer and can empathize at the deepest level with human suffering. Jesus didn't come to take it all away, but to walk with and in humanity. Many years ago now, I conducted a funeral for a 3-day-old baby. We laid her to rest beside her sister, who died 2 or 3 years before, in a hillside churchyard with horizontal rain pelting at us. And it felt as if God was saying, I'm weeping with you. Jesus doesn't, on the whole, take away immediate suffering, but Christians believe that his death and resurrection, which of course we're about to remember and celebrate in the next couple of weeks, have opened up eternal life and an end to suffering in eternity. Indeed, the final book of the Bible has these words: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more.'" The Bible actually has many references to suffering. St. Paul writes in one of his letters this: "We boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that's been given to us." Suffering is complex and yet also very simple. That's the way life is. Life is tough. For me, being a Christian doesn't take away suffering. Perhaps it makes one more alert to the varieties of suffering in the world around us. But my faith also helps me to make sense of suffering, knowing that God's with me in it for the long haul. Sam Wells, the vicar of St. Martin the Fields Church in London, has written a book for Lent called A Cross in the Heart of God. He ends in this way. He's writing about the criminals who were crucified beside Jesus, one criminal on the either side of Jesus. One of the criminals turned to Jesus and asked Jesus to save himself and them. That's the irony of the cross, writes Wells. If Jesus had saved himself, he couldn't have saved us. His powerlessness shows us the endurance of God. Jesus hangs on the cross to show us the love that hangs on. Wells writes, "Hang on to that love. It will never let you go." Well, that's certainly my experience, and that of countless others too. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Sally. Thank you. Thank you very much, Abbas and Anthony and Sally, for 3 very sincere and unique perspectives on the question. please do use the Q&A box below, not the chat box, if you do have a question. So I will start the questions now. One from yourself, Abbas. This is from an anonymous attendee, asks, surely humans suffer because of their negative thinking, not undermining the difficulties people are experiencing right now. Isn't the actual suffering a choice?
Okay. I mean, I don't think we could disagree necessarily with that. I mean, there are cases where people suffer as a result of their choices, but that does not mean that the binary opposite would hold true as well. So people do suffer because of their negative thinking. I agree that that can be the case. And I agree that actual suffering can often be a choice, but again, I mean, that's not necessarily always the case. Some suffering, people have no choice in that. I'm thinking, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East over the last 15 years, and I saw war-torn populations where people didn't have a choice in experiencing. They didn't make the choice to be refugees, or they didn't choose to be displaced from their origins, but that was something that was imposed upon them. So those people actually perhaps gave a completely different perspective on suffering, because rather than, despite their conditions, and this is personal experience that I've had with them, despite their the conditions that they exist in, they didn't exhibit negative thinking. They were some of the most optimistic people that I've ever met. So I'm not sure what the question exactly is trying to ask, but perhaps Anthony or Sally may have a perspective on that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Abbas. I've got actually a different question for yourself, Anthony. The questioner says, thank you very much for your excellent and optimistic presentation. As a humanist, do you believe it's possible to have both the humanist philosophy of life and a belief in a higher being, i.e. God? You're on mute at the moment, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for the kind words. Yeah, it's a good question, and I go into schools as a humanist school speaker, and quite often I get asked this question, because after my presentation and chat, quite often, say if I'm speaking in a faith school, they'll go, well, that's my religion, and I go, exactly, because and the way I answer this is, if you strip out the different doctrinal aspects of most religions and the actual different types of supernatural belief, the core of every religion is humanistic by its very nature, because we experience reality. It's common to us as embodied creatures. So so underneath all the religions is belief in the goodness of people, the power of love. So I think there's a lot of common ground between humanist thought and most of the religions. But humanism, and I distinguish that between humanistic beliefs, which I think is contained in all religions, and humanism itself. All humanists believe that the reality is what we can see, and don't see any evidence for the supernatural. So as a humanist, humanists will be either atheist or agnostic. So I agree with Mark that you can believe in God and have a lot of the humanist beliefs. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Anthony. Sally, the question here, why is it that some people suffer so much more than others to the point that they're not able to endure more and become suicidal?
I don't know is the simple answer. There's a lovely book that I read many years ago when I was studying, which talked about God coming into the messiness of life. And there's something about life which is messy, isn't there? And the fact that it's not equal. We can offer people equality of opportunity, but we know that people don't all experience the same things in life. And somehow some people do just have a really raw deal. I think about some of the people that I've met, both professionally as a priest, but also when I was teaching. Think about one young woman in particular, who I'm still in contact with, who just had such a raw deal in life. And I remember being amazed that she'd made it to 21, because there were so many times when she talked about ending her life because of the stuff that was going on. And that's just the way life falls. And I guess it's down to all those of us, whether we have a humanitarian concern or whether we have a faith behind us, to be supporting each other and supporting people who are going through the really roughest times. I think there's something also for a few people where actually we can almost, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but almost wallow in our suffering, that sometimes we can go through stuff which is tough when actually there might be a way out, but sometimes it's more comfortable to reside in tough stuff, because we know that to find a way out might involve counselling or searching ourselves, and that actually means going through a pain barrier to come out the other end, and that can be extremely difficult. So there are no easy answers to any of these things. It's the way life is.
Okay, thank you very much, Sally. Abbas, question here: who is responsible for natural disasters?
The fracking companies, but no. As a Muslim, I believe, in the omnipotence of God. I believe that, I believe that God sustains the world, and therefore natural experiences that occur in the world do occur. They do occur with the knowledge of God, and they do occur. They do occur under God's eye. And then there are other natural disasters that are man-made. Humans have a role that they play within that, and as the Quran reminds us that corruption spreads in the lands and in the seas by virtue of what man's hand has brought forth. So man has a role to play within some of these disasters that occur. But if I speak from a theological perspective, then yes, I do believe that in the conception of God that exists within Islam, that what does occur within the face of the earth certainly happens, with God's knowledge, and doesn't exist outside of His omnipotence.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, not easy questions, these, are they? So, Anthony, we now have one for you. Do humanists ever pray?
The easy answer to that is no, because who would a humanist be praying to? Because we don't believe in God. But that doesn't mean there isn't a sort of spiritual part of humanist life. We can still look at beautiful sunsets and wonder at the mystery of existence. So there's still that wonder and spiritual, existential wonder at the beauty of everything. But we enjoy it for what it is, and don't try to overinterpret it. We just enjoy it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And Sally, one here from you. It appears with all the brokenness and trouble in our world. Suffering evidences that this current world isn't the ideal. And the questioner says, I would see this as God's ideal before sin entered the world. Wouldn't that suggest sin has played a part on this earth and tainted life as we see it today?
I think it depends how you interpret sin, how you would describe sin. Some Christians get very uptight about sin, and I say enjoy sin, but they talk a lot about sin. And I think the church went through a phase when we did overemphasize perhaps the place of sin in the world. I don't want to underemphasize it. And I suppose I would describe sin as simply disobedience to God, or not something like breaking the law, but simply just behaving against God's laws, if you like, against other people. But I think there is something about the fact that we are a fallen world. I'm quite sure that God created a perfect world. If you look at the book of Genesis, God says at the end of each of the days, phases of creation, God looked at all he had made and it was good. And then when you get to the last phase, when humans are made, God looks at them and says, and it was very good. So God created something that was intended to be good, should have been good. But of course, as soon as people have got free will, then people start creating the circumstances for things to go wrong. And that means that creation, in a sense, is tainted by us. There's a part in another of Paul's letters where he talks about the whole of creation, not just humans, but all of creation groaning, waiting for the liberation from this, which Christians believe what will happen at the end time, whenever that comes to be. But it's difficult to try and tie it all up together, isn't it? And to say that, I suppose we have to say, yes, we've messed up in some ways, but there is also innate goodness. I think I probably verged away from the question a bit there. Possibly dodged it a bit.
They're quite difficult questions, these. So I think we've got time very quickly. I'll ask this same question to you all. So I'll start with Abbas. The questioner says, thank you to every speaker, very powerful. What I feel is missing is how to reduce suffering, he says, by reducing the human behaviors, or maybe modifying the human behaviors which cause so much suffering, like greed, pride, and focus on ourself. Do you have any comment to that, Abbas?
Yes, I mean, one could even argue that one of the most powerful lessons to come out of any experience of suffering or hardship is the notion and the idea and the sense that human beings are extremely fragile and susceptible creatures, and within that, we realize that we are not a type of God on earth, and that we are not supreme rulers on earth who have a right to to enjoy and exploit the earth as we see, but that we are part of a creation upon which or above which there is a God, and that in and of itself kind of tames the lower self or the ego of man, in order to realize that, as Pharaoh says in the Quranic narrative, Pharaoh says that I am your supreme Lord, and he says this to the followers of Moses, that I am your supreme Lord. And some of the in the spiritual tradition of Islam, some of the Sufis would say that this sense of superiority exists within every single human ego, and sometimes may manifest itself as wanting to have some type of leadership or superiority or privilege within the world. But oftentimes suffering, when we experience suffering, that sense of that, that ego becomes tamed. And that's why oftentimes it's in moments of suffering that we can revisit ourselves and we can revisit the human traits that we may have let get out of control, like greed and like caprice and so on, and kind of bring them or moderate them and bring them back to a type of balance.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Abba. Thank you very much. Anthony, on the same question, do you have any comments on that at all?
Yeah. In some ways, I agree with Abbas. It's the important thing is balance, but I do disagree with this concept that greed, pride, and focus and the negative emotions sit separate on their own. Because the important thing to realize with emotions, 80% of our brain is used to manage emotions, and every emotion has a positive and a negative. So for instance, love can become obsession, fear can become xenophobia, self-esteem, which is really, a big thing nowadays, to have self-esteem, well, that can easily turn into pride and too much of a focus on self. So to pull these apart is impossible, because we would cease to be the humans we are. I think the important thing is that we keep it in balance. We enjoy the love, and the negative side sometimes is important as well. Like if you're under threat, it's important to protect yourself and self-defend yourself. So sometimes aggression is allowed, but again, it's keeping everything in proportion and everything in balance. Every emotion has evolved there for a reason, and most of it is protective as long as it's kept in balance.
Thank you, Anthony. Sally, if you just got a few more minutes, do you want to add anything to that at all?
Just briefly say, again, I'd agree with Abbas in many ways. I think as Christians, we would say that we have the model of Jesus, who shows us in his earthly life how to live, and that would seek to emulate him. And I guess we would also say we believe that the Holy Spirit is that which enables us to do that. But because we're human beings, that's really tough to do. And I think one of the big pressures these days is the pressure that the media puts on people, and all that people are trying to sort of struggle with, to live up to particular role models, to live up to particular ways, and to have the courage to say, I'm not going to follow the herd, I'm going to seek a better way, which puts other people first. It's actually really difficult to do. And if we did that, we could avoid quite a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Thank you very much, Sally. Well, 3 very, very interesting perspectives. Thank you so much, Anthony, Sally, and Abbas. It's been a real pleasure having you here to speak. I'd like to thank the people behind the scenes for their technical support. The recording of this webinar will be put onto the website, as the other 2 webinars have as well. So all it's for me to say is please stay safe, have a good night, and please do, if you wish, join the 8 o'clock vigil outside on your porch. But thank you very, very much to everyone who's come, the Mayor of the Royal Borough and all our attendees. We very much appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.